One, we are going to be moving on to talk about our next theorist, and this is still in the humanistic school of psychology, and that is Abraham Maslow. Some of you may have studied Maslow when you were took intro psych or maybe even a developmental course, but I really like talking about Maslow because in some ways he is the foremost spokesperson for humanistic psychology. And in some ways, Rogers was really more well known for his counseling theories, but Maslow really, he didn't do anything with counseling. It was all about personality theory. So we're going to delve into his theory a little bit here today. The first slide that I've got, just a nice picture here of Maslow, but the next slide that I have up is a Mentimeter quiz that if we were in class, we would actually do this. But I'm asking you in this to think about what you need today. What is one thing you need today? And you don't have to actually get on Mentimeter and do this, but think about it. Is it a hug? Is it more time? Is it a nutritious meal? Is it a good exercise session? Is it understanding from someone? Really, what is it? And I ask that you think about that because Maslow's theory is all about needs and how needs are the main motivation that we have. So we'll start off with a little bit of background information here about Maslow. He lived from 1908 to 1970, so he wasn't quite as old when he died. And sometimes he is considered the father of humanistic psychology. Let me pull this up here. Oops. The father of humanistic psychology. And we'll get into that even deeper so you know a little bit about that. And like most of the other theorists that we've talked about, his theory very much reflects his childhood. He talks about having a really lonely childhood. His mother was very cruel. She was extremely strict. And he talked about how in adulthood, he talked about how he hated her. And really, until she died, he never had much of a relationship with her. Now, looking back and kind of analyzing what was going on, it's probably the case that his mother had schizophrenia. Of course, then it wasn't necessarily diagnosed as such, but so there probably was really a reason for her behavior. His father, he said, made him feel ugly and stupid, but Maslow later made peace with him. But growing up, he was pretty close to an uncle, so he did have one good one good parental figure in his life. Maslow actually began by studying law, and eventually he obtained his psychology degree from the University of Wisconsin, and he worked with Harry Harlow. And if that name doesn't ring a bell, take a look at that picture in the right-hand side, because Harlow was the guy that did the monkey study, who separated the baby monkeys from their parents and then, or from their mothers, I should say, and then looked at how that affected them. So one of the most famous studies that we talk about in child development. And later on, Maslow went on to continue work with monkeys by looking at the sexual dominance of monkeys, which is kind of interesting. So, a little bit more about Maslow's work. In the 1930s, he worked with a guy named Edwin Thorndike. And if that name is familiar, Thorndike is the guy in the 30s and 40s who did the cat in the box, basically the law of effect and operant conditioning. So, really, Maslow had a pretty wide variety of experiences. He worked with a behaviorist, he worked with a developmentalist. At one point, he went under psychoanalysis. He never studied it, but he was psychoanalyzed himself. He met Karen Horney at one point. But eventually, he sorted through all this and decided he wanted to study healthy human beings. And the purpose of that was that he felt like there were ways to improve humankind, and we needed to do that. In order to do that, that had to be done by studying healthy human beings. Children, one of the first subjects that he began studying actually was his own child. He was absolutely fascinated with his first child, and especially the innocence and the naivete of kids. And so he just continued along those lines. This link here, I'm not going to test you on it, but I think it gives some really good, useful information and some biographical information about Maslow, and also has a little bit of an interview with him. So again, Maslow really was the person to put humanistic psychology on the map, and he actually helped coin the phrase. So, humanistic psychology, we talked about this with Rogers, but just to say it again, looks at the uniqueness and the potential of individuals that all are in the process of becoming. So, becoming is a process. And this guy, obviously, this is Photoshop, but this guy who's up here, he probably feels like he's conquered the world. He has arrived. But in Maslow's theory, you never really arrive. You're always in the process of becoming something different. And the quest for a meaningful life is a process, and really it can be somewhat of a difficult process. So his theory is really built up over that. Okay, so before we introduce kind of the basic things about Maslow's theory, the hierarchy of needs, I want to mention a couple of basic beliefs that Maslow had that serve as the underpinnings for his theory. And the first one is that human beings are innately good. And if they display any kind of evil types of behavior, it's because their basic needs are thwarted. Their basic needs are really not met. So, as an example here, this is a picture from Hurricane Katrina a number of years ago. And what happened in Hurricane Katrina is that people descended on the Superdome in downtown New Orleans. It became a really terrible place where, people weren't able to have sanitized water. They weren't getting food. They had no privacy. They had no place to go to the bathroom. And so people started doing just terrible things to each other. They were killing each other. They were robbing each other. So what Maslow would say is that those people weren't necessarily evil, but their bad behavior came from having their most basic human needs being taken away. And that makes sense. Maslow's theory very much emphasizes creativity. All forms of self expression are considered creativity to Maslow. So normally we think about writers and musicians and people like that, but essentially any kind of self expression is considered creativity. And Maslow really didn't care for formalized education. And he felt that education only promoted conformity, because everybody comes in, you sit at the same desk, you learn the same kinds of lessons. And so education could really be detrimental to creativity, according to Maslow. Maslow also studied healthy individuals to come up with his theory because he believed that healthy individuals were the best way to create a more universal science of psychology. He wasn't like Freud, who studied psychopathology and people with mental illnesses and then generalized that to everybody else. Maslow studied people like Gandhi or Eleanor Roosevelt. And even though none of us are Gandhi or Eleanor Roosevelt, those are people we aspire to rather than people that are less healthy, obviously. And then finally, Maslow firmly believed that animal research was not helpful to understanding people. Now, this comes on the heel of Skinner and John Watson, all the behaviorists who really did study animals. But in Maslow's mind, animals were irrelevant to understanding such human characteristics like courage or values, humor, love, those kinds of things. And this mouse here is supposed to be moving. I don't know if he is for you or not, but okay. So those are some of the values that we really can't glean from obviously studying animals. If we do a little bit of a summing up of Maslow's theory, the core of Maslow's theory is motivation. And I mentioned at the beginning about needs, but motivation, he said that people are always wanting organisms. So when you think about that, and he's borrowing organism, that's the same kind of concept as Carl Rogers. And if you think about it, it's probably true. He said wanting organisms rarely reach complete and total satisfaction. And it's true. Aren't we always wanting something? Aren't we always looking to the next thing? Even if we're feeling peace and fairly satisfied, we're always really reaching, like it is in this picture, for the next thing. So this next slide, I'm not going to read this, but I'm going to pause for a minute and just let you take a look at this. This is a really meaningful quote from Maslow. Affirms the idea that I talked about with Rogers, that subjective experience is key. So we can have the same experience, but we both have different reactions to it. It's all the lens or the glasses with which you view the world. And what his point here is that we really rely on our subjective evaluation of things to determine whether it's growthful. So if you take a class in biology and you love it, and then you take another class in biology and you really love it, and it just continues, that tells you you are growing, you are moving in the direction that you need to. So, since Maslow is talking about motivation, let's start off by talking about two different categories of motives that Maslow tends to do or talks about in his theory. Category of motives that Maslow talks about are the deficit motives or the D motives. So we are motivated in our lives to fulfill or to fill a deficit. And these involve basic needs aimed at survival. They are usually physiological, so eating, sleeping, going to the bathroom, generally sexual needs are here, and they are urgent determiners of behavior. So, for example, if you're hungry, you don't care about going to see a nice play, or you don't care about what the teacher's talking about in school. Or you all know many of you have probably gone to a class feeling tired, and who cares what's going on in class when you're just so tired? So, these deficit motives are the things that have to be taken care of before we can really care about anything else. And for the most part, it's kind of characterized by routine and drabness. You sleep at the same time, you eat at the same time. Apparently, I was thinking about pancakes when I first put this in here because that's what the stack of pancakes in this image is. And then here's a picture of my little boy when he was about maybe a week old or so. If only we all could sleep like babies at times. They're just great sleepers. So once we have our deficit motives taken care of, which hopefully all by the time you get to class, for the most part, just a baseline are taken care of, then we can focus on our being, what are called our being or our growth motives. These are inborn tendencies we have to develop our biological potentials, the ones that we're born with. And these lead to life enhancement. This goes beyond just basic biological deficit needs. So if you take a painting class or if you enjoy doing that, that's fulfilling a growth motive. You can survive without that, but it really enhances your life. Or if you do volunteer work, again, we can survive without that. Being in college, you all are fulfilling a growth motive by being in college because you don't need to do that to be able to survive. And even sometimes the choices in the classes you take at college. If you take an art class just because you want to, all of those things. So you all at least have, for the most part, your baseline of deficit motives met, and you're now working for the most part on your being motives, your B motives. As I end this, I'm going to move to this last slide here. I want you, and hopefully you're taking notes on this, to think about a few recent actions or motives or behaviors that reflect the deficiency or the D motives in your life. And, you can go with the obvious ones like I ate breakfast because I have to eat to survive. So think just today, what are some of the basic things that you've done? Maybe you put on a coat before you went outside. So those are some of the needs and the motivations for doing what you did. But then, and this is going to be similar for all of you, but then I want you to think of a few recent motives or behaviors that are primarily growth oriented. So these are things that don't satisfy your D needs, but they fulfill your potentials and enhance your personality development. So if you made a new friend this morning, for example, if you went to some kind of organization or some kind of gathering and you met someone and started talking and struck up a conversation, that would be enhancing your D motive. Many of you are registering for spring semester right now, so maybe you decided to take a class as an elective for the fun of it. That would be enhancing your D motives. So we're going to end with that today. When we come back to class the next time, we're going to delve into these motives a little bit more. And Maslow arranges all of his needs on a hierarchy, which is probably at least familiar to some of you. So we will get into that the next time we meet.